Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SustainOSS Academic Working Group. This isn't just going to be Academic Working Group today, but that is the hour this is scheduled, and that's who most of us, I think, are coming from. But very excited to talk today about FOSS Foundations, and especially fossfoundation.info, no S in the URL there. And of course, we have Lauren Gardner as well from OSC to join Shane Curcuru talking about fossfoundation.info. So it's going to be very exciting talk today. For those of you who are new to these calls, because there's more than like 10 participants, we're not going to do introductions. If you would like to throw your name and your institution, university, company, private LLC that you have for yourself or your Mastodon, you can put all those in the chat. And that's just a fun way to see who else is here and to get you engaged. Because I really don't like talking, and I don't think people who like talking alone. So it'd be great to see other people's just comments and stuff. You can also put your profile pronouns if you like. So thank you so much. Welcome. We have a code of conduct. SustainOSS.org has the code of conduct. If you have any issues with anyone here, it's a pretty generic one. We did make it custom for that for our group. But it's the normal one. Be nice, be excellent. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, email me. Here's my email. And if you're uncomfortable with me, you can email Lauren or Kira. One of them will put their emails in the chat. Lauren, is that okay? Cool. I feel like I've done that enough with you to know that that's okay with you. And we'll figure it out. And we'll try to make sure this is a safe space for everyone. This is not under Chatham House rule, like some of the calls which I educate are. This is an open session. This is being recorded. This will be online. So be kind. And the chat as well, someone might read the chat. So if you really want something to be said there that isn't public, just say not public, and we'll respect that. That means you can live tweet this, you can share it on social media and so on, which is excellent. The format today is we're going to have around 10-15 minutes for Shane Curcuru to talk about fossfoundation.info. And then we're going to have Lauren Gardner from OSC talk for around 10 minutes as well. And we're going to be talking about basically what are FOSS foundations, how do they work, and how do they work within an academic setting. I know that Shane would love to have input from all of you about what fields we should have on the website. So after that, we're going to have discussion around how we can improve fossfoundation.info and how we can think about foundations in general for academia. From the academic perspective, foundations are really interesting because they're one way of getting money to projects. They're not the only way. As you know, academia normally also comes along with large institutions. Institutions are very slow and they take a massive cut, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But if you will have general questions that aren't related to fossfoundation.info and aren't related to OSC, you can still ask them. This is supposed to be an open forum to talk about those things, which gives us a lot of ground to cover today. So I hope that's okay. One of the ways we can cover the ground efficiently is if you have questions, share them, put them in the chat. And Shane and Lauren, if you're okay with being interrupted, let speakers know when you start talking. I think those are most of the things I normally talk about at the beginning of these calls. Did I miss anything obvious? Anyone? No. Okay. If I mute you, it's because I just want to make sure that we can focus on the speaker and you may be talking, and that's not personal. With that having been said, I think, Shane, I'm going to allow you to share your slides. That's done. And take it away. Thank you so much.
Share screen. I'd like to share just.
It should work now.
Yep. Oh, I need to actually give it the okay. Portion of screen. Snaps.
You got it.
Yeah, we just try this again.
For those of you who don't know, Shane is an awesome human, long runner in the open source community circuit. Worked at Apache for a long time, I believe. Now runs its own sort of consultancy, Ponder Things, and has been making fossfoundation.info in his spare time. And I was like, you have to come talk about this on this call. Please come talk about it. Shane, I'm still not seeing anything being shared.
Yeah, I need to. I've never actually shared with this thing before, so I will have to quit out of Zoom and come right back. Apologize.
Oh, okay, cool. Don't know any good jokes. I'm trying to think of what else to fill this time with. No, John Junkins, can you hear us? It looks like you were having issues with your headphones.
I
Just
was
checking.
having a little bit of technical difficulties. I think I'm all set now as long as you can hear me.
I can hear you. Jamie clearly has interacted with me online or somewhere in the past. Last week, I finally saw my golden eagle for the year in this county. Golden eagles are incredibly rare in New England. They only migrate through from their southern wintering grounds in the Appalachians back up to their breeding grounds in the boreal forests of northern Canada. Very rare to find, and I found them on the geese fields where I've been maybe 30 times in the last month and a half. Looking at geese, looking for a cackling goose. It's my least favorite activity unless a giant eagle shows up and scares them all. So that happened, and I was very excited. That's my favorite bird I've seen recently. I was elated for the rest of the day. Oh, look, we don't have to talk about birds. Excellent.
Yes.
Okay,
Sorry about
Shane,
that.
take it away.
So let's look at, is this sharing something nice for a big browser screen?
I would zoom in a tiny bit.
Yep. So essentially this
Better.
is, the purpose is FOSS Foundation's directory. I've been in open source for so long and have been watching researchers come by and do a study on Apache projects and communities and then on Linux ones. And I said, hey, wouldn't it be useful if we could have a metadata repository that categorized all of the major FOSS foundations by useful things? I started by working on some things I was interested in, which is nonprofit type budgets, things like that. But there's a lot of other governance data and how projects work data that I thought would be useful. So essentially, let's go to the next tab. How can I make this? I apologize. This is not. There we go. That's much better. So essentially, this is a plain GitHub Pages Jekyll website, but I want to be able to share this as structured data through an open API endpoint so that people can then, when you do an analysis of different kinds of foundations, or when you want to learn about foundations, you can find useful and structured data that would be good enough for research purposes to compare, for example, 501c3 foundations versus 501c6 foundations, or foundations with larger boards or smaller boards, things like that. I'm not quite sure what researchers would like. I hope we have a lot of things that researchers might want to start with already. And that's one of the things I'm looking forward to getting input from this community on. I've already gotten good feedback from practitioners who work in the foundation saying, oh, I didn't realize so-and-so had this kind of structure or whatever. So this is essentially what the human readable side of the foundation directory is all about. So the Apache Software Foundation, that's where I'm from. I use simple identifiers that are human readable, and I have a facility for finding those and getting them. And of course, basic structural data about a foundation, right? Simple governance data about a foundation. So this is both obviously the board size and how the board is constituted, whether it's elected or whether it's a self-perpetuating board, right? That might change things in terms of governance. One of the things in terms of data philosophy is I want to make sure that wherever I can, I am both providing the structured data here, as in board size is 9, it's a number, the number of directors. I also provide a link so that if you want to verify who's actually on the board today, what are the bylaws of this organization? So I'll provide a link to those things as well as some structured data. One big question, especially for researchers, is what things do we need that are structured data in these foundation records? Because some of these are, a governance description is, I want to be able to provide an example to practitioners of saying, roughly, how does the ASF have their projects be governed? Which might not be useful for research yet, but what would be useful for research in terms of capturing governance structure? Is there some framework that we could add and store as additional data here that would be useful for people who are doing research of, how successful are projects over the long term, depending on specific criteria of their governance. I point over to VM Bresseur's governance documentation when it's available. One thing for a lot of the foundations in the US, I have been using ProPublica's great nonprofit explorer to suck down tax data, which in the US is nice and easy to get and is consistent. So that's all in here. And that also funds the sponsorship models. So we also have a data set of about 30 to 35 foundations in terms of modeling what they say are their sponsorship models, how much it costs per level, and the actual benefits a sponsor gets at each level for recurring corporate sponsors, typically. And policy and trademark, of course, those are certainly interesting in terms of who uses CLAs or DCOs, what license do they have, different codes of conduct. So one thing I found interesting was just myself looking is, do foundations or major projects list their codes of conduct very obviously on the front page, or do you have to go look for them, which I thought was kind of interesting. So essentially, this is the kind of data we currently have for about 40 foundations, most in the US, a number in Europe. One of the things I would like to do is provide an open API. So let me bring this up. So this would be essentially a read-only API. So you could come here, call _foundations list.json, and you will get a list of the IDs that we have tracked in the database or in the GitHub repo. And then, of course, if you would like to come to this link with Foundations ASF, you'll get that record we just saw, except as a YAML file, right? So this is the endpoint of one of the Open API specs. So this is simply a zero maintenance way that I can provide read-only access to all of our data in a structured way. And here is a schema for, because of course, researchers in particular want to know, what data am I getting? Here's a foundation object. Right now, I have a very small list of required fields because essentially this data is either I've put in or people who work at these foundations have put in, right? We don't have much other input yet because it's only been recently launched. I would love to see researchers who wanted to store things about foundations use this, and we can add fields. And in particular, what kind of data quality do we need? Because right now it's about foundation practitioners of things that are interesting to them, including sometimes a description of the organization. That's useful for us. I don't know if it's useful for research, but I'd like to figure out a way to make this single source be useful for both communities, which means we have a lot more input, which means we have a lot more useful data in it. And that's the basic point, right? Essentially, I think it's enough structured data so that if you want to compare different foundations and some of their structure to each other, we can do that now. If you want to compare sponsorships or finances, we can do that now with data in the US. Of course, in Europe, it's much harder to get actual financial data. And I have several other ideas in terms of, if we have a way somebody can describe governance in a structured way, I would love to add that. And one thing I've thought about is, how do foundations present themselves? So wouldn't it be interesting to go to all of the, hi, you're a new committer, here's what to do pages, which I'm planning to collect, and then do a text analysis to say, is this easy to read or not? Does it use graphics? I'm not quite sure what researchers would do, but I think that would be another interesting thing to do. And that's what I have, and I'm happy to take questions and have your input.
Thank you so much. That's excellent. I think I'm the main person who asks questions in the chat. So
Okay.
I'm going to ask a couple real quick. I think, Lauren, before you talk, if that's okay. So first off, Shane, this is a lot of work. Did you do all this manually, or is there any automatic stuff going on to build these 40 different pages?
Once I wrote a schema, I wrote a few tools to sort of build the Jekyll structure out, but the data collection, I got a little bit from scraping, but most of it is manual verification or manual entry. So
awesome.
We've
Okay,
got
cool.
a handful of people who have contributed for their foundations, but not many yet.
Excellent. Okay, so that's really, really useful. That shows that there's more work that could be done. The next question I have is, it's great to think about it as a database for researchers. What I'm curious is that for academic projects, is there any information about which fiscal hosts are more likely to host you or not? Do you have any information like that, either in a description or in an actual field?
I was actually just thinking about that. From my perspective, I built this from the Choose a Foundation website, where people who who are working in a project and want to find a home would know who would want to host them. But that doesn't address fiscal hosting. And I do need to add that as a field, one, and do need to add a fiscal hosting type somehow, because right, the ASF accepts targeted donations, but those are only for generic services. We don't pay individuals or maintainers. The Python Software Foundation has some grant programs for individuals and some services. So we need a sort of set of descriptions of what kind of fiscal host they would be in terms of that side. So no, that is the next thing to add. And of course, then a very simple way of seeing the differences, right? Show me the foundations that are C3 or C6 that are accepting new projects, that might be fiscal hosts, that might, require copyleft or not require copyleft, right? Those are pretty easy to add.
That's really great. My final question is, do you have a list of all the projects that each one of these fiscal hosts or foundations are hosting anywhere? Like, obviously all the OSC projects is a bit much, but maybe.
Yeah, each, there's a field. I'm not tracking that because it changes all the time, but I have a field that says project list, and that should be a URL to the homepage that will show you the list of their projects.
Cool. Awesome.
If we think there's a need for a second one that's like a data URL versus a web URL, but not many places actually have a data feed of their projects directly. So, but maybe.
Thank you. Well, I'm not seeing a lot of other questions in the chat. Feel free to ask any if anyone has any. Andrew, I knew you would have looked into that. That makes a ton of sense. Lauren, can you talk a bit more about what fiscal hosts means? We just had a really good chat looking at the 40 or so that we have. What do you think?
Sure. So also, if y'all have any questions, please do put them in there, because I would love to hear your thoughts on, what you're looking for, what type of help you're looking for. So basically, I work for OSC. We are a 501c6 fiscal host. Our purpose is broad. I know that I could go down a rabbit hole and try to describe the difference between a C6 and a C3. And I won't do that too much, but I do think it's important to know, especially for the people and the types of projects that are on this call. C3s are really for public benefit. And the types of projects that are on this call, I think, would more illustrate, or could illustrate more easily that they are for public benefit. So it might be more appropriate for you to actually join a C3. In general, the IRS does not like open source projects and consider them, or doesn't like open source projects to be considered for public benefit, right? It's very hard to prove that. So we are a C6. It's fairly broad. We can host any project that is either community focused for open source. So for example, the GitHub Education, GitHub Education Group. Trying to think of other collectives that are community focused and just do meetups and talk about open source. Or
Sustain.
we could actually, what's that?
Sustain.
Exactly, that's a great one. Or open source projects themselves can be hosted by open source collective. And the biggest difference, that is probably a negative in that is that there are more grants that are applicable if you are or hosted by a C3. So for instance, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation does not give any grants to a C6. They only give to a C3. Or I think Sloan as well, only to a C3. So we wouldn't be able to accept those grants on your behalf. However, as a C6, we have a bit more leeway, again, because we're sort of broad, in what we can choose to support. So for the IRS, again, because our determination, instead of for public benefit, a C6 is for member benefit. And all of the projects that we host are basically part of our member organization, right? So if the expenses can be proved to benefit the open source projects that we're actually hosting, then we can help pay those out for you. We pay invoices and reimbursements. And what we've found with some of the academic projects that have come over to be hosted by OSE is that they have a need for, I would say, sort of self-administration and maybe even a tool that they could use to administer funds more easily than what might be available with their institution, right? With the administration or institution. I'm not sure. I don't. And again, I'm only speaking on behalf of OSE, so I'm not sure what types of tools are available for them to pay out invoices. But we've recently hosted a few projects who have come over because it's easier for them to transfer a sub amount of their grants or funding onto the platform, have it be held through open source collective, and then spent through the platform, through the open collective platform on their project. I would say another thing, Shane, that I was just thinking of to add, if you're going, if this tool could be used for people to figure out what Fiscal host, might be a good fit for them, is if you are applying to grants outside of it being a 501c6 or C3, do they have a UEI? Right? Are they, can they accept a NSF? Like, are they registered with the NSF? And can they accept any sort of subaward as a grantee? So those are things that you might want to think about. I wrote down some things that, I would like to know from you all. What is helpful when you're thinking about applying, or have y'all ever thought about how many, I guess, are currently involved in a fiscal host relationship? Florian, I know you are.
I think it's a tough question for this crowd because a lot of us are actually just sitting in open source program offices or are researchers.
Oh,
which makes it a bit harder to say like whether or not you're just an open academic project. I think a question that's coming to my mind that I put in the chat that might be more relevant is, Lauren, can you talk about the differences in shared services between foundations and between fiscal hosts? I know that OSC offers more things. So for instance, like a subaward ability, right, to deal with a fiscal sponsor, than, well, less things than I think NumFocus. NumFocus, I feel like you're more hands-on than say OSC, right? Just in terms of scale. And then there's all sorts on that spectrum, right? There's Linux Foundation, which I guess is even more hands-on if you're in the incubator, but less if you're just fiscally hosted. I'm curious.
I don't want to speak on behalf of, NumFocus or another, but I will say that, again, OSC's mission is really broad, super broad. And it's probably a lot easier for C3s to raise money and give grants internally to their own projects, right? Because C3s will have a more direct focus or direct mission. That also prevents them from hosting as many open source projects, let's say, as like OSC hosts. I think we host right now over 3,600 projects. So we are not able to offer as much probably hands-on and detailed support. Some of the projects that might be better suited for OSC would probably be, let's say, someone who is just getting started and just trying to figure out how to bring in funds and spend funds without worrying about the taxes themselves. Like a project that would also be appropriate for OSC would be one that already has some administrative folks or people who can do sort of administrative tasks internally, because we don't have that type of, I think, one-on-one with a lot of our projects. We can get involved in writing contracts, or whether they're independent contractor contracts or sponsorship contracts, but we're not going to go out and raise funds on behalf of your project. We can also help you employ maintainers if you have enough funds and have a way to bring in those funds regularly. Again, we can't help you bring in those funds, but if you already have, a dedicated sponsorship relationship with a lot of funders and can bring in the money directly, then we can employ through like full-time employment, W-2 employment, through a employee of record relationship that we have. You don't know any fiscal host that raises funds for you?
For you, I don't know,
Right.
except maybe LF again, if you're the grandchild. NumFocus, do you do that? Okay, I didn't know that. So NumFocus will raise funds for you, so everyone can be hosted by them. Great.
If you can apply, that's what I'm saying. It's, you know, we're definitely more broad. But if you can find someone, and I think that's kind of the thing, is it's hard because you don't really know when you're walking into these situations what it is that you need to look for or ask for. So for example, if you don't have any governance, there are, you know, there are even 501c6s that have started up from people who have left. LF, I think. I'm probably speaking out of turn. I don't want to, but there are people who have realized that that is a need, right, in the fiscal hosting landscape for people to have an option that is maybe more focused on let's get your project healthy and create some sort of structure and governance structure for your project. And that's really their focus. So I think, yeah, it's really hard. If you don't know what you're looking for, then it's really hard to ask those questions. But I would encourage everyone to just like take their time and maybe even just talk to a few of the fiscal hosts and say, this is where we're at. I would encourage every single project to think about what their goals are for like the next 1 to 3 years and go to a fiscal host and just say, this is what we want to do. How can you help us do that? Because we all have different programs and different strengths that we can offer. And it might be a good fit and it might not. I don't know if this is true for all fiscal hosts, but I think it might be. Like, we kind of want you to grow out of us, to be honest. Like, it is a testament to our success that you are successful and don't need a fiscal host anymore, if that's where you want to go, or you exit some other way. But yeah, I'm here to help answer any questions. I feel like I'm rambling.
No, that's useful. That's really great. It is also hard for me to judge. For those of you who don't know, I used to work at OSC, so I'm also familiar with what a fiscal host does.
Yeah.
Shane and Lauren, I think we'll open it up to a sort of a wider discussion if we can. I'm still the main person asking questions. So unless we get some more questions coming soon, I'm going to direct it to another place, which is for academic projects that you're hosting. What do they need that's different than your average open source project? You mentioned the 501c3 funding problem, which is, so this is an issue for those of you who don't know. Lauren can't say this because she works at OSC. I don't work there anymore. I work for Sustain, which is the best. OCF folded. They did so in a really tough way that really screwed over a lot of their participants in a sense that they had a very short amount of time to figure out I need to get a new fiscal host. And one of the hard things about being a project that's fiscally hosted is that some major funders, academic funders, I'm pretty sure Bill and Melinda Gates is in this category, and I'm pretty sure Chan Zuckerberg is in this category, only really give to 501c3s.
Yeah.
And so you need to figure out how to have a 501c3 be your host. Open Source Collective isn't one, it's 501c6. Now, you can go set one up, but that's a whole lot of work. And so then the question is like, okay, well, what are the available foundations out there? Which is kind of one of the reasons Shane has built this amazing platform. What's out there and what do we do? I really like fossfoundation.com. I think it's an excellent example of what to do. I just want to have all the stuff from fossfoundation.info in that site because I know it's only got like 6 foundations on the cover page. But my question is, for any of your projects which are fiscally hosted, and Leah and any other fiscal hosts here, I know some of you work at universities who may also host things, like Mike Nolan. I'm guessing OpenRIT hosts some projects in some ways. What do the academic projects need that's different than just your standard curl or open source project? Does anything jump to mind?
I mean, one question I would have, not as an academic, is like, do you have a whole category of, if we're going to work with somebody, we have to have all these IP rights and assignments in some way or not? because I'm an open source guy and I'm like, we use Apache or we use GPL. Okay, I'm done. If you have that kind of question, that's going to be a really detailed one to get into.
Leah, then I think Lauren talked. Leah?
Yeah, I was just going to say that some of our academic projects, or many of them, have needs to hire developers, either for grants or for grants they're applying for outside of the university. So they may be doing work within the university, but also doing work externally. So the need to be able to hire and pay developers or independent contractors outside of the country, outside of the university system, as well as apply for grants, again, external to the university. Those are some of the needs I have that come up, as well as just help with community building and getting access, growing their project to be more community driven, not centered just within the university, but as they move farther along in their growth cycle, to be able to then, increase that contributor pipeline.
That's a great one. Mike has a question in the thing, which I'm gonna ask that now, unless Mike, you would like to ask it, and then I have a question afterwards. People, if you want to talk, you can raise your hands as well. Mike?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, it's not a very detailed question, but I've had a lot of folks I've spoken to recently sort of raise, I guess, worries around the sustainability of fiscal hosts that they might enter agreements into. I know Richard brought up Open Collective Foundation, but also Foundation for Public Code in Europe also recently shut down. And then, the tech sector as a whole is going through a great ordeal of changing budget priorities. And so I'd just be curious about anyone here, if we could talk about just like the financial sustainability of these of these foundations, and particularly I think the 501c3s. But I mean, I've heard all sorts of gossip about other ones. And, I'd just be curious, people who are kind of closer to these types of organizations, if they could sort of speak on this issue and the recent news in a way that's, respectful and everything like that.
Lauren, you want to take that?
I cannot speak towards anything, related to OCF. But I can say that from OSC's standpoint, and if I was like on the outside, the one thing that I would take a look at is on ProPublica. You can see the 990 filings for every fiscal host. You can see how much money they bring in, and you can see that separated by the totality of like how much they're bringing in for their hosted collectives, but also their revenue, right? The fiscal host revenue themselves. That's a really important number to look at. Take a look at also how much money that they're putting out. I think it's important that you find a fiscal host that can have a healthy balance between how much revenue the fiscal host themselves makes, while they are still paying out a majority of the money that they're bringing in, the programmatic funds that they're bringing in. So for example, last year we were really happy that OSC was able to disperse 80% of the incoming funds that that came in on behalf of our programs. We don't want to really be holding a balance, and I think that that's also kind of a negative position for fiscal hosts to be in. So if you can see a healthy cycle of that money while they're still maintaining, positive growth as a fiscal host, then yeah. Shane?
Just from the traditional open source perspective, which helps some of you and might not help the rest. The big name open source foundations, Apache and NumFocus, I'm pretty sure, and Python and Linux Foundation are fine. At the ASF, we were concerned with the big layoffs. We said, okay, not only are software companies are going to spend less money, but a lot of the people who were our contacts were laid off. How is that going to affect our sponsorship income? And we actually have been happily surprised that it has not affected it that much for the big names. But that doesn't apply for the smaller foundations that you don't instantly recognize off the top of your head. I don't know how they are doing. They are going to have a slightly harder time with the corporate financing, at least. I don't know about grant funding, but in the current market.
Lauren, and then we have Gerardo's question.
Yeah, there was another, and it's not necessarily related to like open source, but there was a large study that was put out this past year for all fiscal hosts in the United States. And when they, compiled the metrics to take a look at how long it might take, or what I guess that revenue threshold would be for fiscal hosts to really be profitable, meaning that they were receiving enough funds where things weren't necessarily one-offs, where things could sort of be applied like on a systematic level. They realized that a fiscal host kind of needed to bring in $10 million a year for it to be profitable. Use that as you will for a measurement when you're also taking a look at other fiscal hosts. Yeah, I can find that for you, Mike.
Gerardo has a question. How is the application of U.S. Fiscal Code Section 174 affecting fiscal hosts and securing funding in the U.S.? I don't know a lot about U.S. Fiscal Code Section 174. Gerardo, can you explain more about what that is?
Well, it's from an act from 2017 that came into force in 2021. There has been some clarifications lately, and it's about the research and development expenditures. Whereas now, what a company, or I suppose also would apply to a foundation, pays to software developers has to be, well, scaled down for the next 5 years and not in the year itself. And if you haven't heard about it, maybe you're not being affected by it, but it seems to have lots of effects on the industry, and it's part of the explanation why there's so many layoffs lately, because although it came into force in 2021, only now enterprises are really understanding the real impact of this, especially on venture capital and startups, where you can no longer balance what your profits are with the costs that you're currently having with your developers. So
I can say that that's one thing that we sort of keep an eye on when we take a look at the expenses. If we find that something looks not in proportion, right? We have to be a little cautious when we see some expenses go out. So we might, it is to the benefit also of our hosted organizations. So we do sometimes step in to have conversations. Why do you need, to spend this amount, for this developer? This is like an average cost. Is there a way that we can help? We do the same thing though it's not just development costs. We do the same thing for other costs as well. So if somebody is getting into a relationship to rent, let's say, a venue, and they send us the invoice and we realize that the terms are not favorable, then we'll step in at that point as well to help them negotiate the terms of the contract before they sign anything. I don't know if that's exactly what you're talking about.
I'm posting here a link.
Okay, thank you.
But as you haven't heard about it,
Yeah.
probably is not affecting you right now.
Got a really good question in the quat. Quat? Ah, that's not even a word. In the chat from Daniel Schoen, which is what hurdles prevent universities from being fiscal hosts? This is like the big question in the room for me as an academic, right? So if you're an academic and you're affiliated with the university, do you need fiscal hosting at all? And Bill makes a good point that, well, universities take like 60% of your funds.
Yeah.
They take the cream of the crop and the rest of the cream and half the milk. So I'm trying to think of like other hurdles. One hurdle with universities, I'm trying to be political here, which is rare. I'm never political. Universities can take a long time to pay you. Like way too long. Like I would love to pay my rent with my actual money at this point. So please, university in question, please pay up. I don't think anyone's here, but yeah, universities are really, really slow in a way that's just totally unfeasible for a lot of people to deal with. So that's a really good point. Before we get to Gerardo, I'm curious, are there other ways that universities aren't the best fiscal hosts or interact with fiscal hosting? Does anyone else have any more comments besides the time scale and the huge cut? Gerardo, is your question, raise hand and answer to that?
No, but just to heads up, because normal practices in the private consulting, it's around 180 days or plus for your invoice. So it's level with the industry. Not good, but okay, that's what you expect. As for the overhead, well, it depends a lot on the universities. I've heard, but maybe it was too long ago. It was 35% of overheads, but times change.
Jason? And then Mike?
As far as like difficulties with universities, a couple of things that I've run into is, I'm not sure if it's easier or harder at a university, but hiring people is really difficult, takes a long time, and can be really expensive. So having to pay for both their salary and their overhead and their benefits plus overheads can often take, it's I think I'm paying at least 2.5x compared to the salary compared to what I pay. And it takes 6 months to hire somebody, even longer to fire somebody. And so but I'm not sure if it's easier with other fiscal hosts. So I guess that's maybe a question that I have is like going through a fiscal host instead of the university, do they make that easier? Or would I be more on the hook for figuring out how to do benefits, figuring out how to find people, these kinds of things?
That might be a good thing for the for you, Shane, to put on the website. How is it easier? How long does it take to hire someone, something like that? And also, any more comments, put them in the chat or raise your hand. Mike.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to RIT, and all this information is public on their website. So by default, RIT takes a 48% overhead cut that is broken up to the various departments and stuff. So even like, us at Open at RIT, when we get a grant, we get a portion of that overhead as well. And depending on our standing in the university, that portion could be bigger or smaller. Also, funders are able to dictate to the university if they have mandatory minimum overheads. Oftentimes foundations that provide private foundations that provide grants to universities, they will demand a smaller overhead, and in that case the university is pretty much willing to accept it because it's still money and revenue. So in that way, I think it's important to note, particularly if folks in here are interested in like funding these programs and thinking about running it. From our perspective, I can definitely back up the problem of hiring in universities, and also just the general kind of additional measures that are put in place in a university context. If you're a research, like an R2, R1 university, all of your grants are going to be processed like they're an NSF grant. And if anyone has ever had to be involved with an NSF grant, it's tons and tons of work. And so the university is just set up to process these. So if you're doing a lot of very small, informal funding, bringing on people part-time for short amounts of periods, I think this is when a university is exceptionally, not the right choice for fiscally sponsoring a project. And certainly in our case, when we are participating on projects like these, we're oftentimes working with another another organization that is at least going to be fiscally sponsoring that part of the project. So all the funds aren't running through our university because it's needless work.
If I can piggyback on that, I will say that is what we're finding, works well for us as a fiscal host. We are a sub-awardee basically. So the grant is really being received by the university, but if they have a small amount or a smaller amount of those funds that they need to use to pay people who might be tricky to pay through the university, OSC pays, we use WISE for our outgoing payments. So we pay people all over the world, and if it's easier and quicker, they find that that even though they're going to have to pay 2 times a hosting fee, they're going to, the university is going to take a cut on the money that comes in, and then they're going to have to pay another. We charge 10% for any money that comes in to OSC for fiscal hosting. That they'll still have to pay that, but they say that it's more efficient and cheaper in the long run to do that, so that they can pay their contractors more easily. But yeah, I think that's something that only people who have kind of been doing this for a while would even think about that. It's a hack for sure. And I think that, if you have a project that's just kind of going, the first time maybe, then you're not really going to think about that as an option, like 2 fiscal hosts or 2, or 2 hosts.
I've often seen some fiscal hosts demand that you're only hosted by one fiscal host, which is another problem.
And no outside money policy. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
It is really important to look out from probably the contract that you've gotten, the grant award, and then also to talk to your institution about to see if they allow that or not.
I was thinking another risk for fiscal hosting at a university is that you're kind of privy to the whims of the provost or the whims of academia in general. And so, for instance, digital humanities can often be in the classics department. Classics departments get axed, right? That's just what happens at for-profit universities. So that's a big issue. So being situated in the library is somewhat easier. I know that's where a lot of OSPOs have made good headway, because it's less likely to run up against, well, this isn't a sports team and it's not computer science and it's not patentable, so I don't care about this. So that's like something else that's more relevant. Mike.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of what you said. One thing we found is as long as you're bringing in money, you are generally in the good graces. If you ever stop bringing in money, if you aren't, in the good graces of your provost or whatever, if they don't have a particular love for you, the university can be a pretty ruthless place when it comes to supporting these types of things.
I think what's interesting around that is that a lot of open source projects that are coming from academic perspectives don't have long-term governance plans. They don't have a sunsetting plan, and they have a high turnover where you have students coming on and helping out, graduate students coming on and helping out, or lab assistants helping out. And then once the grant's over, once the project's done, the whole project just kind of sits there and it's thrown over the wall open source. It's like great to have a license, but no one's checking it and no one's going to improve it. This also happens with any open source repository that's attached to a paper, where it's like, we made this for this paper, why would we update it? We got what we wanted out of it, right? We don't have to keep doing it. And so when that's attached to a university, it can fall prey to issues where fiscal hosting has to keep the thing going in the long term, or actual server hosting in occasion. If it's not on, say, GitHub or GitHub, or on an institutional version of that, you're at risk of that going down. Whereas fiscal hosting in the private sector may be a bit more likely to want to keep those things alive, at least in the short term. I don't know about the long-term institutional safe holding for most fiscal hosts. A good exception for that would be the Software Heritage Foundation, which is a fiscal host that's dedicated towards hosting open source projects ad infinitum, because that's the whole point of the thing. One question I have for you, anyone really, Lauren or Leah, sorry, Shane?
Yeah, just one note. So the Apache Software Foundation is one of the few places that has an attic. So every project that comes to the ASF, if we don't have enough maintainers to respond to security issues, which we define as 3 people who are at least listening, then the ASF will take the product, put it into the attic, which basically means we take the entirety of the project, mailing lists, issue trackers, code, everything, make it read-only, and then put a big banner on it. So we do archive things. We don't promise that we'll maintain them, but absolutely every Apache project that has made a release will be archived indefinitely. Love that. Which is something we need more foundations to do, both for sustainability and for research, right? But
it's hard. It's hard. The long tail of projects that are frozen don't add to the ROI for any project, for the company or the fiscal host. I have a weird question, which I think is probably a good question to end on, because we are running up on time, which is, open source has been around for 20, 30 years. Excellent. Shared code has been around for longer. That's really great. Right now, we have a whole ecosystem of fiscal hosts. Shane has 40 plus on fossfoundation.info. There's probably double that number globally, maybe a whole lot more if you open up the ranks or what that means. We've seen some fiscal hosts start to contract because of the fees they're charging weren't enough to keep up with management decisions or to keep up with the cost of doing business, right? Because it's tough out there in the real world. You have to pay taxes somehow. Do we think that the local contractions that we've been seeing with open source funding and with fiscal hosting, in the sense that it's only 2 data points that we're using here, which is public foundation code and OCF, do you think that's a natural part of the ecosystem? Or should we be worried about a fragmentation of fiscal hosting and people taking grants from each other? And maybe we should actually contract or grow? Do you have any thoughts about how the ecosystem as a whole looks at the moment? Any worries or concerns? It's a very open-ended question, but I'm kind of curious what you think. Leah, I see you looking up at the ceiling. You don't have to take that one, though. It's okay.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Lauren.
I've got thoughts. I actually, we saw, well, okay, I'll just say it's very interesting because on the Open Collective platform, we see a lot of fiscal hosts, and we see sometimes our projects go from us to like another fiscal host, or from another fiscal host to us, or whatever. And I think, again, back to kind of what I was saying, is what is that project's goal for the 1 to 3 years? Because it might make a lot of sense. And even if you look at the open source collective's landing page, we say what type of project we're good for and what type of project we're not good for. And there's like a lot of types of projects that we're just not really a good fit for. And so really it might be on the fiscal host responsibility to say, okay, like you're at the point now where this other fiscal host could probably serve you better, right? I think we have to get better at that. And Shane, I'm really excited to dig into your tool and maybe even, I don't know, in my copious amounts of spare time, I would love to help, because I think that this might be a really good tool for the fiscal hosts as well to better serve our projects, And
I would love if either of you or anyone here has any ideas on how to successfully hold that conversation better, how to talk about what we can do to sort of hand off to another fiscal host, or think about academic hosting, choose an academicfiscalhost.com. Really, really curious. Thank you so much, Daniel Schoen, for putting hurdles ID'd in the chat. That's awesome. I'm going to record this. Well, it's already being recorded, but I'll put it up on YouTube. I'll have a transcript, which will be generated through Whisper or something, or Otter. So you can read that later. I thought this was a really interesting conversation. Thank you all for coming. And feel free to jump into the discourse on SustainOSS.org if you have more chats about this, or to use any of the Slacks that we're on. Normally we're on the Open Collective Slack on SustainOSS, but you could also, we're everywhere. I think that's it for time today. So unless anyone has any final comments, thank you so much and have a lovely rest of your Thursday.
Bye, Richard. I hope you find some more good birds.
There's always good birds. All birds are good birds.
Shane, I would love to chat with you sometime.
I'm going to stop recording so I don't have to edit
Okay.
this.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone. Okay.